So all the FIA needs to do now is figure out what they're going to spend that $7 million on. And realistically, what they should probably do is invest in some decent race directors and some personnel to support the race directors so we don't have incidents like the last few weeks. Here's the long story short of the Red Bull cost cap breach. Red Bull did enter into the accepted breach agreement with the FIA, which basically says they're not going to take it to court. They've compared notes with them, and they said, you know, we'll take whatever the punishment is. The penalty for breaching the cost cap for Red Bull was a $7 million fine and a 10% reduction in aerodynamic development time, which actually is huge. I've seen a lot of reactions on Twitter. People are saying, oh, that's nothing. It's a slap on the wrist. And I do agree. $7 million is not a big deal for that team. It's a lot of money, but I don't think in the grand scheme of things, considering how much their revenue they're probably likely generating and not able to spend on the car, I think $7 million is actually probably not a big deal. However, the 10% reduction in aerodynamic development is actually probably a very, very big deal. Fines do not come out of the cost cap. Fines do not come out of the cost cap, which is interesting. And I could probably argue that they should come out of the cost cap if they're to be more impactful, right? The thing that makes this super, super interesting is the way that aerodynamic development works this season depends on where you finish in the Constructors' Championship. So here's what that looks like now. And if you can't see this, I'll zoom into it. So from 2022 onwards, if you are in first place, you get 70%. If you're in second place, you get 75%. And if you're in third place, you get 80%. So right now we're looking at Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes. Now, on top of this 70% reduction of the baseline, Red Bull will get a 10% reduction of that. So they'll be effectively at 63%, which is pretty severe. Instead of having 5% less than P2 teams, they will have 12% less time and 18 less than P3. And that's a pretty huge difference. So I think this is correct. Right now, the default allowance at 100% is about 40 runs per week. Red Bull will only be allowed to do 25 runs per week, whereas whoever finishes P2 will be allowed 30 runs per week. That's pretty impressive. So anybody on Twitter saying that's not severe enough probably doesn't know what they're talking about. First of all, I'll just leave it at that. They probably don't know what they're talking about. So here's what happened then. Here's what happened. The FIA basically said, you guys didn't do anything shady or submit anything you were supposed to, but you did mess some stuff up in this submission. And everybody goes back to the Ross Brawn clip of him saying something like, anybody found to be fraudulently breaching the cost cap will get shit on, effectively is what Brawn said. He said, this thing has teeth. But what the FIA have said is, Red Bull, you guys have not done anything shady. You've submitted everything that you were supposed to, but we didn't agree with the way some of it does. But everything was there on paper. The initial Red Bull submission came in at $4.6 million under the cap. But the people checking the book said, you know what? Some of these exclusions are in the wrong place. So that added up to $6.5 million if those sums add up. Long story short, they were $2.2 million over the cap, which is 1.6, which falls under the 5%, which is a minor breach. So the FIA did, from what I can tell, this wasn't really clear. This part was not very clear. The FIA did say, oh, but by the way, if you had done this tax credit properly, you'd only be £500,000 over the budget, roughly 0.3%. So to conclude on the cost cap, the cost cap to me reminds me of the engine penalties. They're not particularly strong. For example, a team knows that if we fit a new engine, we know what we're going to gain from that and what we're likely to lose if that engine fails. The same thing happens with the cost cap. They said, well, here's what's likely to happen if you breach the cost cap. I'm not saying that somebody deliberately breached it, but it's the exact same thing. The engine penalties are more clear than the cost cap for sure. But in the exact same way, all the other penalty systems disproportionately impact the slower teams. Every penalty disproportionately impacts a slower team. Engine penalty impacts a slower team more. Cost cap penalty, slower team more. In race penalty, 10 seconds, penalizes a slower team more.